Vaulted Truths, Episode 1. She gave him everything, her strategies, her clients, her trust. And for 3 years, he smiled at her face, while quietly, methodically, handing her entire career to himself. By the time Sarah realized what Daniel had done, her performance review was flagged, her reputation was in pieces, and he had already been promoted. But Daniel made one critical mistake. He forgot that Sarah kept records of everything. This is her story, and the vault is open. Sarah was 31 years old when she landed what she called her dream job, a senior marketing strategist position at a mid-sized tech company in Austin, Texas. And from the very first week, she threw herself into it completely. She was not the kind of person who clocked in, did the minimum, and went home. She was the kind of person who stayed late because she genuinely cared. The kind of person who would rework an entire campaign on a Friday night, not because her manager asked her to, but because she knew it could be better. Within her first 18 months, Sarah had built the company's entire content pipeline from scratch. She had developed a brand voice that clients actually responded to, and she had personally brought in 3 major accounts: a regional healthcare company, a logistics firm, and a fast-growing fintech startup. Accounts that, combined, were worth over $2 million in annual revenue. Her director praised her in every quarterly review. Her clients trusted her implicitly, and Sarah, being Sarah, believed that the work would always speak for itself. She was generous, openly, almost naively generous, with her knowledge, her frameworks, and her ideas. She believed that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that belief is exactly what made her a perfect target for someone like Daniel. Daniel joined the company 6 months after Sarah, brought in as a lateral hire at the same level. He was polished, well-spoken, and immediately likable, the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee order and knew exactly when to laugh. On his very first day, Sarah walked over to his desk, introduced herself, and offered to help him get up to speed. She shared her process documents, her client communication templates, and her campaign frameworks. She even introduced him personally to 2 of her most important clients, sitting with him in those early meetings, vouching for him, and making him look good. She was rooting for him, genuinely, because that was who Sarah was. She had no idea, not even a whisper of a suspicion, that she was handing Daniel every tool he would need to dismantle her. The first sign came exactly 6 months later. Sarah had been working on a major campaign proposal for the healthcare client, the company's single most valuable account. She had spent 4 weeks on it, 4 weeks of late nights, early mornings, and 3 full rounds of revisions. The evening before the client presentation, she shared the draft with Daniel, asking for a quick second opinion. He read through it, looked up at her, and said it was brilliant, that the client was going to love it. Sarah thanked him, finished her coffee, and went home feeling good about the next morning. She arrived at the conference room at 8:50 the following day, 10 minutes before the presentation was scheduled to begin. And Daniel was already there. Seated at the head of the table, laptop open, slides loaded. Her slides, her campaign, her words, presented as his, to her client, in front of her company's leadership. He had emailed the deck to senior leadership the previous night, under his name only, describing himself as the project lead. Sarah sat down. She did not say a word. She told me later that the feeling in that moment was not anger. Not yet. It was a kind of vertigo, like the floor had tilted and she was the only one who had noticed. She smiled through the entire presentation, answered questions when asked, and even clapped at the end. And when her director pulled Daniel aside afterward to tell him what a fantastic job he had done, Sarah congratulated him. She shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and Daniel looked right back at her and said, "Couldn't have done it without the team." That night, alone in her apartment, the anger finally came. But Sarah did not send a furious email. Instead, she opened a new folder on her personal laptop, labeled it simply with the date, and saved every document, every email, and every version history she had from that project. Something in her gut told her to start keeping records. That instinct would later save everything. What happened in that conference room was just the beginning of a pattern. Daniel would approach her, casually, naturally, always with some reason that made perfect sense. He needed to understand a client's background, or he wanted her input on a strategy. And Sarah, still extending the benefit of the doubt, would share. Every single time. And every single time, the work would surface later under Daniel's name. A proposal she had outlined became his presentation to the VP. A brand framework she had sketched out on a Tuesday became his signature approach by Thursday. But the theft of credit was only one layer. The other layer was more insidious. He was systematically undermining her reputation, quietly, politely, and with surgical precision. In team meetings, he would say things like, "I think Sarah is still working through the details on this one. I can cover it for now." Or he would mention to their manager, privately, that Sarah seemed stretched thin lately and that he had been picking up some of the slack. He always framed it as concern, and because he was consistent, people believed him. Slowly, invisibly, Sarah's standing in that company was being hollowed out. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah arrived at work, opened her inbox, and found an email from HR. Her manager had submitted a formal performance improvement plan, citing a consistent pattern of missed deadlines, poor cross-functional collaboration, and a failure to demonstrate initiative. She read it once, then again, and with each reading, something cold settled deeper into her chest. Because every single item on that list was either entirely fabricated or directly traceable to a project where Daniel had taken her work and left her with nothing to show for it. She was being formally penalized for the exact work that was actively earning Daniel praise and promotions. She closed her laptop, walked to the restroom, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she splashed cold water on her face, dried it carefully, and walked back to her desk. She sent a brief professional acknowledgement to HR, saying she would respond within the week, picked up her bag, and left the office early. That evening, she sat on the floor of her kitchen, letting the full weight of the last 14 months settle over her. The grief of it was about what she had allowed herself to believe, that honesty was always rewarded, that generosity was always safe. She had believed all of that, and it had cost her 3 years of her best work. She sat there for a long time, and then, slowly, something shifted. Not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. She knew exactly what she was going to do. Sarah spent the next 3 weeks in a state of absolute focus. She did not confront Daniel, she did not go to her manager, and she did not tell a single colleague what she was planning. She simply documented. Every night, she went through her personal drives and email archives, pulling every original file she had created, with its metadata intact, showing the exact date and time it was first authored. She built an airtight chronological record of every piece of work that had been presented under Daniel's name. When the folder was complete, she requested a meeting with the VP of the entire marketing division, a woman named Carol, who had a reputation for being direct, fair, and deeply unimpressed by politics. Sarah walked into that office on a Wednesday afternoon, set the printed folder on the desk, and for the next 45 minutes, she walked Carol through the full timeline. She did not raise her voice, she simply laid out the evidence, piece by piece, and let the timestamps speak. Carol listened, leaning forward slightly, flipping through the documents with an expression that grew progressively more still. When Sarah finished, Carol looked at her and said, "Leave the folder with me." 2 days later, Daniel was placed on administrative leave. 1 week after that, he was terminated. His LinkedIn went quiet, his name disappeared from project boards, and it was as if he had never been there at all. Which, in the way that actually mattered, he hadn't. He had never built anything. He had only ever borrowed what someone else built and signed his name to it. But by the time Daniel's termination was confirmed, Sarah had already submitted her resignation. She had not waited for the outcome, nor did she angle for a promotion. She simply handed in her notice, worked her final 2 weeks professionally, and walked out of that building for the last time. Not because she had lost, she had won, clearly and completely. She left because she had understood something on that kitchen floor. She had spent 3 years building someone else's empire, and she was finished doing that. 6 months after leaving, Sarah launched her own boutique marketing consultancy. And from the very first month, it was busy. Her first 2 clients came without any outreach on her part. They called her. 2 of the major accounts she had originally brought to her former employer reached out within weeks of her departure. Their contacts explained, quietly, that they had always felt the relationship was really with Sarah, and the moment she was out, they followed her, without hesitation. Within 18 months, Sarah's consultancy was generating more annual revenue than her entire former team had produced combined. She had built something that was entirely, undeniably, provably hers. When I asked her what the real victory had felt like, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said this: "The hardest part was not what Daniel did to me. The hardest part was realizing I had unknowingly given someone permission to define my value. The day I stopped waiting for someone else to recognize my value and just decided to go build something that made it undeniable, that was the day everything changed.
That is the truth that was locked away in today's vault. A woman who was quietly, professionally, and deliberately erased, who chose documentation over drama, and who walked out of that building, not as a victim, but as a founder. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever sat at a desk and watched someone else take credit for what you built, drop a comment below. Tell us what happened. Tell us where you are now. The vault is open and we are listening.